So do we see our a nice meadow picture up on the screen? Perfect. So um, for those of you guys that haven't been to the botanical garden, we're about 175 acres. We are also not only recognized as a botanical garden, but an accredited museum as well. So we have a lot of collections that we manage and things like that. We are located right next to the airport in Norfolk. Um, but we've got a lot to offer. We're kind of like a little pocket of all of these habitats and wildlife and beautiful areas in the garden. The one that's shown here is part of our annual wildflower meadow that leads up to our butterfly house. You guys will see that on the programming this summer. But again, we are a museum. We do offer a variety of tours. We have a ton of classes that we offer. We're actually one of the only gardens that has boat tours as well. We have a canal system that runs through our garden that makes us pretty unique. So we've got a lot to offer the public. We're also one of our ways we support ourselves because we are a nonprofit. Weddings and things like that, event venues make us a destination as well. Popular wedding spot is the Rose Garden, but we're also that's one of our collections, the woody plant collection. So these are things that we manage and we constantly report on when we add new things, take it out. It helps us keep our status. And we actually have one of the largest rose gardens on the East Coast. Actually, I think it is the largest on the East Coast. So Mother's Day weekend is one of the best times to see it, also again in October. Additionally, our children's garden, the Wow World of Wonders, I highly recommend people checking it out. When I was a horticulturalist for 5 years, this is one of the areas I managed. It's not just a splash pad and a ton of fun for kids. I mean, it's a great thing too, but there's also a huge variety of gardens showcasing different areas around the world, as well as native areas throughout the United States. So it's definitely fun for the whole family. We've got a whole other section of children's programming and activities. Um, like that was mentioned, we also have a summer butterfly exhibit that I oversee. It's all native butterflies and moths. You walk through and see all of these different species that emerge throughout the year. You guys will also be able, we'll be doing a guided portion of this butterfly house as well on the June program when you guys visit the garden. So you'll be able to see all this stuff firsthand. We did a remodel on it last year, so we're really excited with the progress and the future expansion of this exhibit for us. Additionally, I always love showcasing this. In the middle of Norfolk, we are a botanical garden, but we are a thriving habitat as well. All of these photos were taken on site. And that's something I love to stress to people, like not only are we showcasing historical aspects of horticulture like collection and display gardens, but we also do, and in the past years especially, focus on utilizing green spaces as habitat. Motivating homeowners to see their yards as habitat, not just for these cute and cuddly guys on the screen, but also our insects and pollinators. That's a big part of our conservation goals, is focusing on regional conservation, which means supporting these guys through our yards and things like that. And then just a couple last slides about the garden. We are in the middle of a massive construction project. It's been a huge capital campaign. We are doing a huge expansion. We are adding in a new visitor center, what we're calling a parking garden, where it's all going to be eco-friendly, permeable pavers, rain gardens, things like that. A restaurant, and then additionally, we're also adding the two showcases are these two massive conservatories, these two glass houses that are going up, one will be a tropical biome with canopy walks and elevated garden spaces. And additionally, we're also going to have a desert biome. And this allows us to kind of pursue global conservation efforts. For example, we are actually permitted, as we're next to the airport, if there's, say it's a plant that's been poached or illegally transported, they defer that plant to us for our care. We also are working, for example, like with the Desert Botanical Garden in Arizona. There are huge swaths of land that are being demolished in favor of residential areas. And we're actually partnering with them. We're able to go in and collect these really rare species and house them and save them from being leveled by these developers. And then we're actually going to be able to showcase them in our glass houses too. So just a couple cool things that's going on here. Construction's, knock on wood, on track despite all the rain we're getting. So it's really exciting. And then actually, we're happy to announce, we're just starting to tell the public this, but if you look behind that far conservatory, that far one, we're actually going to be able to have, and we're going to construct new classroom and lab spaces for all of our programs we do with our local interns and the Virginia Beach Studies programs and all these cool things. So a lot of stuff going on here. So we're happy to kind of showcase it to you guys. We look forward to seeing you in person this summer. But now for the nitty gritty, we're going to get into composting, kind of like an introduction to composting, a primer for it, if you will, how to get from all those scraps you see there, moving towards that nice, dark, rich earth. So with this, again, we're going to kind of overview what compost is, why we want to compost, and then I kind of get into the how-to portion of it. And like that was mentioned earlier, as you guys happen or to have questions, just drop them in the chat, and at the end of the program, I'll go through and we'll answer them. So key things to start with, I want to talk on, what is compost? We throw that out there. Sometimes, people might think it's that, dark stuff that smells kind of earthy that you buy from the garden store. Some people think it's a pile of just decomposing things. It's a combination of all of these, but there is an actual definition of compost. Let's see if this lets me, instead of pausing this, it'll actually move to the next slide. There we go. So yeah, by definition, it is this nutrient-rich decaying organic matter. Compost is a balance of water and oxygen, carbon-rich brown materials, nitrogen-rich green materials, and it's decomposed by various bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms. So we do have a little bit of a formula when it comes to creating compost. We also, in breaking down that, we see those green and we see those brown materials. The green nitrogen-rich materials, those are like the grass clippings, coffee grounds, tea bags, vegetable and fruit scraps, trimmings, eggshells, and weeds that have not gone to seed. We don't want to spread those seeds around. And then we have our brown materials, which those carbon-rich materials, and I like to think of those as the dry materials, pine needles, leaves, tree branches, cardboard, straw, hay, paper, things like that. So it's kind of like the what is compost. But as far as how we get compost and what composting is, you've got these materials we just talked about. They're added to a pile, but how does it become that rich, nutrient-dense substance that we're looking for? That is thanks to bacteria, fungi, things like that exist in this incredibly diverse habitat that is within our soil. Composting itself is the natural process of decomposing organic materials into like a nutrient-rich soil conditioner. And we have to have those materials that I just showcased, those green and brown materials that are then facilitated by these microorganisms, these bacteria and fungi, which break down that organic matter into a simpler substance for plants to absorb. Most of these are going to be bacteria. The fungi are a huge help as well. And then we also do have some macroorganisms like pill bugs and worms that kind of help towards the end of the composting cycle. But as we have this activity, as we have these microorganisms breaking down this organic matter, those green and brown materials, they're going to generate heat as this happens. They're also going to release water, things like that too. It's a whole cycle. So compost itself is a physical substance, but composting is kind of the how and the act of getting that final substance. If we want to break it down a little further, like if we look at the decomposition cycle, we have the initial breakdown, which is we're breaking down that organic compound into simpler substance via the microorganisms. Then we have what we call a thermophilic phase. So as that microbial activity intensifies, the temperature of the compost pile rises. Usually, ideally, it's going to go over 110 degrees. We want to get those compost piles nice and hot. And during this phase, we have those thermophilic bacteria, such as like bacillus, that thrive in those high temperatures. And they're going to be the things that accelerate decomposition. They're going to make that stuff happen faster at those high temperatures. They're really efficient. And this thermophilic phase, this high intensity heat phase, is also really essential for sanitizing our compost pile and killing off pathogens and weed seeds and insect eggs, all that stuff. Eventually, as those thermophilic bacteria kind of burn through their available food sources, we then see what we call a cooling phase. So we have what we call mesophilic bacteria. They're moderate loving temperature bacteria. They kind of move in and start to transition in the finishing process. And then we reach what we call maturation. And this is the final kind of finishing and stabilization phase where we see more beneficial microorganisms move in as the temperatures have cooled. They refine the texture, they and enhance this stability, and they're kind of the ones that are responsible for that really dark, crumbly look to compost that we're striving for. So there's a lot that goes into compost and what it is. But basically, again, we have compost itself as something, and then we have the act of composting in that process. Compost is black gold. It's we're excited that this is becoming more and more of a requested program because it has so many great benefits. And it really is like an attainable resource for a lot of people at home. When we talk about compost, we like to refer to it as a soil amendment. Not necessarily right off the bat as a fertilizer, because it's soil amendment, meaning it has smaller available levels of nutrients. And this is a good thing, that it's a more stable long-term release of nutrients. So that's why we call it a soil amendment versus just compost as a fertilizer. It'll fertilize in a sense, but it's a nice balanced resource of those nutrients. So why do we want to compost? And this is kind of like from a small scale, why do we want to compost at home, all the way to why do we want to incentivize people to compost on a large scale? Why do we want to why do we need composting on industrial levels? Touch on that briefly. So some backyard benefits when we talk about composting. It's really going to improve soil health in a number of different ways. Soil itself is a habitat. There is so much stuff going on beneath the surface that we cannot see. It is a thriving, teeming microcosm of all these different things. Those bacteria, those fungi, protozoa, nematodes, all these good guys that play this crucial role in recycling our nutrients. So it improves soil health by providing a healthier habitat for them, but it's also going to increase things like moisture retention, the ability of that soil to hold and retain moisture, which is good for our plants. When it comes to specifically improving plant growth, it provides organic material, which is good. It provides those nutrients like those nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all these micronutrients like calcium, magnesium, all that good stuff. But it provides it at slowly, steadily released levels. So it continues to provide those nutrients over a much longer period of time, which is really good. This also helps maintain that soil health. These are all interconnected. That soil fertility is increased. That's going to be providing those nutrients, but not only is it providing more nutrients for plants, but it's providing nutrients that are easier for those plants to uptake. It's providing nutrients that are more accessible and more usable by our plants. This kind of balanced, steady supply is going to lead to much more successful plant growth. This steady supply of nutrients is also going to lead to shown healthier root development, steadier leaf growth, more stimulated flowering, which leads to better fruit production. So all around, we're setting the stage for more vigorous and productive plants. It improves soil structure. So this is great. You can, again, using this compost as a soil amendment, it's going to not only provide those nutrients we talked about, it's not only going to foster a healthy environment for those microorganisms that we need, but it's also going to increase the soil porosity. This means it increases the space between soil particles. That's good because creating those stable pore spaces, as well as like soil aggregates, like the clusters of soil, this allows for better air circulation. Again, it helps increase water retention, but it also allows for like better root penetration and nutrient exchange. So all of these things are connected. Compost helps aid all of this. It helps stimulate aeration, it improves drainage in soil, and it also reduces soil compaction, which is great. You can improve your clay and heavy soils. You can reduce that compaction by adding in compost. You can improve the water retention of sandy soils by mixing in that compost as well. This allows it to help with erosion issues. It acts as a soil conditioner. There's so many great benefits to this, and they're all interconnected. But it's such a valuable resource that we can create at home. So these backyard benefits are incredibly important. And we'll get in how to make that. But I do kind of want to touch on not just these immediate benefits in our backyard, but there are some really phenomenal environmental implications of supporting composting initiatives and composting programs. A huge one is lessening our load on landfills. By composting our resources, we're going to reduce waste that enters these landfills. When landfills are already being stressed for lack of space, and to create more landfills leads to more habitat destruction, deforestation, and things like that. So simply composting a lot of our waste can lessen the load on these landfills, especially if we get municipalities and things one day, in a perfect world, to compost along with us, not just in our backyards. But by lessening those landfill loads, we can help reduce air pollution and water pollution as a result, and soil contamination as a result of these landfill creations. By reducing the landfill load on this, that actually can kind of help reduce waste management costs for municipalities and communities. And then, composting itself, reducing that landfill load also is going to reduce the harmful gases and things like that that are being emitted from those landfills. By composting on a large scale, and also at home, to be honest, we can reduce our chemical dependency. So like we were talking about, compost has a lot of great nutrients that can be released slowly in the soil. So as we do that and we're using these natural soil conditioners, we don't need to buy in, add, and use those supplemental fertilizers. It saves us money first and foremost as a homeowner, that we're not purchasing these artificial nutrient supplies. But it also helps us reduce the amount we're purchasing, because creating a lot of these pesticides and fertilizers and things that we're using, that itself is an environmental nightmare. So as we reduce chemical dependency, not only is it good for our wallet, it's good for the environment. One thing I kind of forgot to touch on the last slide, but having these healthy soils and also adding in compost and creating a healthy environment for these microorganisms, that actually does a lot in terms of reducing plant disease and pathogens. So if we have these healthy soils, we're creating these healthy soils, not only are we reducing our need for artificial fertilizers, but we're reducing our reliance on pesticides and artificial pesticides. So overall, using compost can reduce this dependency on chemicals. And then just trying to round it off, using compost, creating compost, trying to motivate more people to create compost, that's going to reduce harmful emissions. Not only is it reducing emissions generated in landfills and this decomposition or incinerators, but we're also reducing travel emissions, waste to and from, and then some of the emissions that are generated in landfills and a result of waste and incineration and things like that. We've got volatile organic compounds, VOCs, various air pollutants. But one of the main things is it's going to help reduce the amount of methane that is created. And methane is the result of anaerobic decomposition. Methane is actually cited as being 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide when it comes to greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So if we can reduce methane creation, that is something we definitely want to pursue. So overall, there's really great reasons that we should compost at home, but there's a lot of bigger, more like large scale impactful reasons too to kind of pursue composting. I know the government's not just going to hop on board and start composting programs for all of us, like recycling programs, but getting more people on board in a regional, maybe neighborhood type scale, there are some good implications there. When we look at the municipal solid wastes, this data is pulled from the EPA. There's a huge amount of this waste that is compostable. As we can see here, if we look at this waste on the screen, paper, food, yard trimmings, wood, those are all compostable things. And they're the huge portions of what's getting diverted to our landfills. The EPA estimates that yard waste, that 13.5% in the US is about 36 million tons of waste that could be composted or broken down. The food waste is really sad. The more you look into it, the more the food waste that's generated. That number is now even higher. This data was the most consistent data that I had at the time was 2018. Recently, now I'm seeing data that is released for 2022. Food waste has unfortunately gone up a lot more, which is really sad when you consider all of those affected by food insecurity. When we talk about food waste, a lot of that is, commercial, but a lot of that too is just at home. I'm definitely somebody who buys a bag of spinach and I might forget it in the back of my fridge and I go visit it a couple days later, like, ooh, gotta throw that out. But what I do now, actually put it in my freezer. I live in an apartment, so I'll put it in my freezer and I can bring those compostable items to the garden to compost on site here. But the US, it's estimated, generates about 80 billion pounds of food waste per year. And it's really tragic how much of that goes into our landfill. About 30 to 40% of the food supply that is generated goes to waste. We're approaching half of the, and when you think about all the work that goes into agriculture, to raising, producing, growing that food, distributing it, all of those things, and just for it to get shipped to a landfill, we've got to work towards better solutions for that. And what better way to start breaking it down at home? One of the things we want to do, we refer to that, what we're facing right now as a broken nutrient loop. So we've got this production cycle that just ends in landfills. It dead ends. It's point A to point B. And just a few more statistics we have here on this slide. About 95% compostable waste will end up in landfills or incinerated. Odd stat here. I just thought it was kind of impactful. If we think about eggshells, average American says is said to eat 250 eggs per year. That's a ton of egg waste. We can throw those compost, or we can compost those eggshells. That is a resource for us. That is something that we can break down. But it is really sad once we start looking at how much food waste is generated in the U.S. alone. And again, this is the what we call a broken nutrient loop, where it's produced, consumed, trashed, and then a landfill incinerated. So composting is one of the ways that we can close that nutrient loop. It's one of those ways we can keep those nutrients being cycled naturally, keep those resources cycled naturally. This is a sustainable way forward, and it's also an act of soil conservation. So obviously there's a lot of work that takes to get to this, but if we can produce that food in healthy soils, we consume it, we let decomposers take over that natural role, and we get that compost that goes back into the soil. That's what we call a closed nutrient loop, and that's the ideal. So it's not something we can all jump into right away, but we can definitely work towards that goal. So all that being said, I know I talk fast, but when it comes to getting started with composting, I'm going to kind of cover things that you can and can't compost, starting your pile, tips, tricks, all that good stuff, different types of composters and things like that. So hopefully now you guys are feeling motivated. You're like, yes, I want to contribute to keeping our soil ecosystem healthy. I want to create the best possible environment for my plants in my backyard. So how do we get from all these food scraps to a nice, dark, rich, nutrient-dense soil amendment? Because it's going to take a lot of work to get from all of that, so let's see, our next slide, to this. It takes time. The number one thing I will say with compost, and I'll reiterate it throughout this, one of the key components I realized in teaching this and creating compost is patience. You can't get that beautiful stuff overnight. Now, there are some cool things on the horizon, technology-wise, that'll let us get to that a little sooner, but patience is going to be one of the big things. But this is just kind of an overview that will break down a little further. But mainly when it comes to composting, layers are important. We want to make sure we're adding in, we go back to those green and brown ingredients, from the beginning of this show, or the slideshow, we want to incorporate a nice solid ratio. 3 parts brown materials to 1 part green materials. Also, 3 parts dry materials, those carbon-rich materials, to 1 part wet materials, that nitrogen-rich material. That's going to be a key component of a successful compost pile. Additionally, we need to turn that compost pile. When we think about all those microorganisms and things, those bacteria, fungi, for those to successfully do their natural processes, they need oxygen. This is an aerobic environment. So we need to turn our compost piles to help get an even distribution of that activity. Now, you could just let your compost pile sit there and not turn it, and eventually you'll get a decomposed substance, but it will take so much longer, and it won't be even even distribution of texture and nutrients. Monitoring your compost pile is important. Ideally, you want your compost pile to have the texture of like a wrung out sponge. We do want some water. We do want some dampness to that pile, but we don't want it to be sopping wet. We do want that compost pile to stay moist though, just not sitting in a puddle. And again, if you can get, if you're really serious about it, they have those really long thermometers for compost piles to check to make sure that temperature is getting up there. But mainly you just want to make sure that, if it's summer especially, or if your compost is a little bit of a sunnier spot, it'll tend to dry out further. We do need to keep that moisture available for those microorganisms that are undergoing those different processes. So we don't want it to dry out completely, but we don't want it to be sitting in a puddle, essentially. We just want a nice kind of wrung out sponge texture to it. And then again, patience. We gotta let nature take its course. We gotta let those microorganisms do their thing. And if we think back to earlier when I was talking about the phases, the thermophilic phases, different temperatures activate different bacteria. So that's just only going to happen over time. So when we start our compost piles, one of the more successful things you can do, like we will see composters that don't allow this, but if you have the possibility to do this, it's really fast, or it's really like a speed run if you're able to get your compost pile to be in contact with the earth beneath it. That's going to help, we say, inoculate the pile with these beneficial organisms sooner. This base layer, usually we recommend adding sticks, wood chips, some kind of larger textured brown material at the base. That larger textured brown material is going to ensure that there's still oxygen availability and things like that at the bottom of your pile. You want to make sure that your pile also isn't in full shade or full sun, ideally. It's been found partial shade is kind of a good mix of a location for your compost pile. If you don't have like a partial shade kind of area, you can still start one for sure. If it's full sun, like we said, you might have to water your compost pile occasionally in the summer. Full shade, you might just have to be a little more diligent about making sure it's not overwatered. And then you want to make sure, again, with that old overwatering, you don't want to put your compost somewhere where it's not draining. Like if there's an area in your yard where you know had a rainstorm like today and it's just going to pool water there for a few days, we definitely don't want to start a compost pile in that area. We want to make sure that's like a nice drained area of our yard. Again, we want to keep that 1 part green materials to 3 part brown materials ratio. This helps our compost pile from getting too wet, not just from us adding water, but also just from the ingredients, the nature of the ingredients that we're adding. There are some key things when it comes to compost that scare most people off. Pests, smells, all that stuff. Those are avoidable if you're correctly managing your compost pile. So these are really important things to not compost. We don't want to compost meat and bone scraps in a backyard system. One, it will attract pests. That's the #1 thing that usually is attracting things like raccoons, rodents, flies, all that. It's if you're trying to compost these meat products. The main thing though, a home compost system is not going to reach high enough temperatures to effectively kill off any harmful bacteria that develop here. So commercial composting, they do. You can compost all these ingredients, but at home, meat, fish, dairy, we're not going to hit temperatures high enough to sanitize our compost pile. So if we're adding this compost to, like vegetable gardens and things like that, we don't want to introduce harmful pathogens. So leaving the meat, fish, dairy out of it, it's going to reduce your chance of pests finding and causing problems, but it's also going to keep you safe. We can't break down fats, oils, or grease. Again, we're not getting high enough temperatures for that. We don't want to compost glossy or coated papers. Those papers, the inks, the types of chemicals used on it, we don't want to break those down if we're going to be using these compost in our vegetable beds. Newspaper is totally fine. The ink they use is completely safe for that, so you can definitely compost your newspaper for sure, but just stay away from the magazines. Obviously, we don't want to do plastic, metal, or glass. We just don't have the capability to break that down. There's not a bacteria, unfortunately, that's going to be able to break those things down. And then a really important one, we do not want to compost pet waste. And when I say pet waste, I'm talking just the strict generic definition, cats and dogs. Again, kind of similar with the meat and stuff. It doesn't reach temperatures high enough to sanitize it. And because of the diet, being omnivores and carnivores, we have the potential to pass down harmful bacteria. Also, there is the potential to introduce pathogens that our pets are suspect to in this compost pile that we do not, again, temperature is not high enough to kill them off. Now you are able to compost like chicken waste or if you got cows, things like that, you can compost that stuff. The difference is the diet. When we look at herbivores like rabbits or things like that, or we're looking at our cows, they are consuming grasses, feed, things like that. They are an omnivore. I mean, they're an herbivore. So that is why you see like composted cow manure and things like that. That is a safe composting waste. It's just traditional pet waste considering their diet and their risk for diseases and pathogens. We don't want that in our compost piles. So just to review, going back to this, our green materials, grass clippings are a huge one. From homeowners, kitchen waste, that food waste. So fruits, veggies, rinds, cores, peels, all that good stuff. Throw it in the compost pile. You can compost your breads, your grains, those, stale bread, things like that. Plant trimmings. We don't want to use diseased plant trimmings. If you have a plant that has a fungal issue, something like that, don't want to compost that. If you have weeds that have gone to seed, you definitely don't want to put that in your compost pile. We're not going to get temperatures high enough to kill those seeds, so we don't want to throw them in our compost pile and then end up spreading seeds elsewhere in our garden beds and creating more work. Additionally, do not put any invasive plants in your compost pile. We do not compost invasive plants here. Invasive plants, for us at the garden, it's like yellow flag iris, different like ranunculus. Those invasive plants, invasive grasses, they will persist in the compost pile and you're just spreading that. So we trash our invasive plants. We got to bag it and trash it. It's one thing that goes to the landfill, but compared to the damage it can do introducing those invasive plants to different areas, it's the lesser of two evils. You can compost your coffee grounds, tea bags, and again, your eggshells as well. I do another class called Garden Myths Debunked where we kind of go through like popular like old wives' tales and things like that about gardening. And one of the things I talk about is eggshells. A lot of people like to incorporate eggshells in the surface of their flower beds, especially tomatoes, to help reduce blossom end rot. When you look at institutions that study this, like University of Washington has some good research on it, the calcium in the eggshells before it's decomposed isn't necessarily viable and attainable by plants in that form. And you run the risk of actually adding more sodium at an unharmful rate than you would usable calcium by adding eggshells directly to your flower bed. So it's recommended to compost them. Those organisms are going to break that down over time into a much more usable form. Just to review the brown materials, again, leaves, pine straw. One thing I always recommend for homeowners, if you're starting a compost pile, get a bin, a bale of pine straw or a bale of straw or hay. keep it next to your compost pile, because if you start to notice your compost pile seems a little soggy, it's so much easier to have that stuff on hand and just mix it in there. So you can have that brown material at the ready to throw and balance your compost pile back. Wood chips are good to mix in periodically. You don't want to do it consistently, just wood chips, because they do take longer to break down. But occasionally mixing in those larger textures like wood chips or branches is good, just because it kind of helps with the airflow within the pile. Sawdust is acceptable as long as it's not from treated lumber. We don't want to use sawdust that is from chemically treated lumber, just because, again, we don't want those chemicals in our compost pile, especially if we are using this in vegetable beds. Cardboard, totally able to compost that. Paper, like I said, newspaper print is fine. That ink is safe. With these materials, the smaller you can make them, the faster that they will compost. So, cardboard is good if you can cut it down into smaller sizes. Your leaf litter, the pine straw, if you could run it through the lawnmower once and get it really nice and broken up, that's phenomenal. If you have like those eggshells, for instance, crumbling and breaking those eggshells down, just a little extra second of work. It is really a much more efficient compost pile the smaller those materials are. One thing I do like to tell people is to leave the leaves as much as you can. If you are vacuuming up the leaves in your yard, because I understand, you've got a front yard, you got a backyard with turf, and you can't necessarily just leave a layer of dense leaves on it over the winter. So if you're pulling those leaves up, raking them, or taking them up in your lawnmower, try to keep them on site as much as possible. Compost pile is a great place for it. But if you can disperse those leaves in flower beds or maybe like the back 40 area of your yard or something, leaves in themselves, that leaf litter layer is habitat as well. And a habitat layer of a forest or an ecosystem is just the leaves. I'm not talking about the soil underneath, and I'm not talking about the bushes and the shrubs above it. That leaf litter layer is crucial to so much of our native wildlife. We have songbirds that only forage for their food in leaf litter. They're ground foragers. They need that leaf litter. We have a variety of really cool, I think I have the next slide up here. Yeah, we've got a variety of cool insects that have to have leaf litter for their life cycles, that they live in that leaf litter. So one of the main things I get asked in a lot of my classes is, like, what happened to the fireflies, or where did they go? And it's sad, but a lot of the times they end up in those plastic bags going to the landfill in fall as people bag their leaves and throw them away. Like, one, that's a really great organic material that is going to go to the landfill, and it shouldn't. Two, you're not only scooping up the leaves, you are scooping up the things that live in the leaves. Fireflies are a beetle that rely on leaf litter for habitat in their life cycle. So unfortunately, that's where a lot of fireflies are going. Bumblebees, are one of our native bees. We've got like over 430 different native bees to just Virginia. And most of them are ground dwelling, but specifically our bumblebees, they actually have a queen. They're one of the few social native bees we have. They will overwinter in leaf litter. We also see a lot of different ants, solitary wasps, which are really beneficial insects, and pollinators. They overwinter in leaf litter. And then the beautiful silk moth, the Luna moth, that's just an example of one of our moths that will overwinter as a cocoon. We also have different butterflies like hair streaks and mourning cloaks that live in that leaf litter throughout the winter. So as those leaves in the fall down, I understand the need to get them off your lawn, but try to keep them on property as much as possible. Again, if you can disperse them in your flower beds, we love doing that here. I know it doesn't look traditional, but what you can do is sprinkle a top layer of mulch, like a decorative mulch on top of that leaf litter. Not only is that a thicker weed barrier for you as a gardener, but you can still get that nice, uniform, traditional, maintained look, and you're spending less money on mulch. So this is my PSA to leave those leaves as long as possible in as many places as you can. When it comes to composting at home and in the kitchen, there's a lot of really cool, easy to use things. Kitchen buckets are huge. We compost all of our waste from our staff kitchens, our cafe, even some of our food truck vendors. We're able to provide them buckets. You could get a 5-gallon bucket with a lid, or you can get a really nice, cute tabletop stainless steel bucket with a lid. That's what we use at the garden. and we collect it once a week. They even make lids that have like a locking lid with like a little carbon filter if you don't want to take your compost out to the compost pile as frequently. You could do like what I recommended for, again, I do this at home because I live in an apartment, but I will keep like a Tupperware or like a gallon Ziploc bag in my freezer. And as I'm cooking, I will just take those compostable materials and I'll dump it in that bag. I'll just throw it in the freezer. Doesn't smell anything like that. Once that bag's full, I just bring it to the garden. And if you're doing this at home, you could just save yourself some trips to the compost pile in the back. And once that bag or bucket's full, you can bring that back out and dump it. That's been a huge help. And honestly, kind of seeing that, like once you start collecting your compostable materials, like in the bucket or a bag, and you see how quickly it fills up, it's really motivating to continue to pursue that because you see what a difference you're making in just like your kitchen at home. These are just a couple examples of some of the kitchen composters that are a little more stylish they have available nowadays. I really like the one that kind of hooks on the inside of your cabinet, just because it's out of the way, it's easy to slide stuff in there. But again, they have some really fancy options. We just have a simple metal bucket with a metal lid that fits on top, and that's what we use in our kitchens here at the garden. Just some common questions and tips like that. So if you smell, your compost pile starts to smell, it's too wet. You want to add some brown materials to help dry that out, and if you can, you want to turn it. A healthy compost pile does not smell bad. It has that nice kind of rich earthy smell to it, but it is not a foul smell. So usually what happens if you have that foul smell, you've got too much green material, you just want to take some from that straw bale maybe, or take some of those leaves, whatever you can, and just mix in that brown material, help dry it out a bit. A small compost pile that is reaching higher temperatures and has small shredded materials added to it, you could get viable compost in as little as 6 weeks. Usually for us at home, if we have a larger compost pile, it's going to take longer than that. And keep in mind, composting will happen faster throughout the warmer months because those temperatures are able to reach higher, or you're able to get higher temperatures faster. So composting in the winter is things slow down, but that's okay because we slow down too in the winter. We're not out there gardening all the time. Just again, a reminder, pests are going to be attracted to like those meats, those fish, those bone scraps, things like that. Not to say you're not going to have a curious raccoon or squirrel every once in a while, but there are composters that have locking lids, which are super useful. We have a few of those that we utilize here at the garden as well. But generally, pests, there's going to be something big that would initially draw them in. And if you don't have too much, if you don't have a lot of space, worm composters are really cool. I have a couple slides that'll talk on those. Or you could use small tumblers. Now, when you guys come to the garden, we actually do have a compost display area with some of this interpretation material I put together that you see here. So people can come to the garden, learn about composting in person, and they can actually test out and see all these different composters, which I'm going to showcase for you guys in a couple slides. Just a couple things to reiterate. The smaller the material, the faster your compost is going to break down. But also just a couple things to avoid that wasn't on the previous slide. We don't want to do wood ash. So if you have a fire pit or you're clearing out your fireplace at home, we don't want to add that to our composting pile. The problem with adding that is it sharply increases the pH of your compost pile. It increases it really quickly, and that's bad because most of those bacteria that we need to break down those organic materials need acidic soil conditions. So that is why we don't want to put that wood ash. If you have a small amount and you have a large compost pile, you could add it. You would need to thoroughly mix it in, but it's just something that changes that compost pH really quick. So you don't want to get carried away with that. We never want to add charcoal or briquettes because they've, different chemicals and things like that they've been exposed to. So those aren't going to go in our compost pile either. Just gonna flip through some types of composters for you guys, just to kind of give you a better idea. The wire bins, these are super lightweight. They're easy to customize. You'll see the next slide, the picture of it. This allows good airflow. It's super easy, flexible. It's the most budget-friendly option you can have for compost. And it's also, if you want to expand it or shrink your compost pile, you can do this with this. You can make these compost bins with really cheap, affordable materials. I also, honestly, if you have the space in your yard for compost bins, even if you opt to go with a different compost pile that you might see later in the slide, if you have the space, I still think it's phenomenal to build one of these in your yard nearby if possible, because it's such a great place to store brown materials. So we kind of do this on the garden as well. We keep a wire square one just so people see what we're talking about when we say wire bins, but also we're able to just put excess leaf litter in there. So that leaf litter is available as a brown material should we need to add it. But also, if we're not using it, it's habitat. We've got critters doing their thing in there, beetles, all those small insects and stuff. So if you have the space, I highly recommend keeping this somewhere. It's just able to, it's a nice flexible arrangement to keep those dry materials on deck. A 3-bin system. So this I think is what people are most familiar with. You'll see, I'll go forward real quick. This is like the popular prefab ones. This is the one you might see a lot of people make pallets and things into compost bins. This is a great way to do high value composting at home. The first bin of this system is what we call the fresh bin. So that's the one that you're constantly adding new materials to and you're turning. When that bin gets kind of full, its volume is going to decrease as these things decompose. You flip those material into the middle bin and you start a new fresh bin. As each bin fills up, you're just going to scoop it over into the next bin where it'll finish. Again, this is just if you have a high volume of compostable material coming from your home. And you might think that you don't if you're thinking strictly kitchen scraps, but if you generate a lot of yard waste, you have a lot of grass clippings, things like that, this could be a viable option for you. Once you kind of, the thought process is with this large volume of compost you're creating, once that third bin is full, it is finished. You've reached a nutrient-rich, dark, healthy compost. So again, just to kind of showcase this for advertising purposes, they just threw mulch in there. It's just shredded hardwood, but it kind of shows you the idea. You've also, you're able to generally with most of these customize, you've got the slats, so you could keep it lower. You don't have to fill the bin literally to the top of the bin. You kind of determine what a full bin is for your household. Now we've also got tumblers. These are my favorite. These are the most fun. The kids that visit the garden love the tumblers. These are on a stand, and they're super efficient because it's easier to mix. People's least favorite thing in talking with them about compost piles is when they have to occasionally go out there with a pitchfork and just kind of stir stuff around. This takes that work out of it for you. So you're able to incorporate that healthy airflow a lot easier. And then additionally, these tend to heat up faster. So again, you get that more efficient breakdown of all those materials. So just to showcase tumblers, super heavy duty ones with the locking on it. You don't need this super insulated metal one. This is really nice though. We've got a couple of the plastic tumblers like you see here on the right hand side. Those are super lightweight. They're easy to spin. You keep that latch closed. They've got ventilation on it, so it's not a completely anaerobic environment. You are getting fresh air exchange, but critters can't get in there. And again, it's just kind of fun to flip and turn. You see it, you walk by it, give it a spin. It's going to turn your compost for you. And as you can see, especially the ones that are black, they heat up quite a bit, so you get a more finished compost faster. And then what's nice about these tumblers, you just flip it upside down so the doors are facing the ground, and you can slide buckets or a wheelbarrow right underneath it, and your compost is dumped in there, ready for you to move around your garden. Now, if that sounds like too much work, transferring your compost to a wheelbarrow, I'll show you this picture real quick. You can get a rolling bin, and we have a couple of these at the garden too. This one, you would literally, it's all the same things of a tumbler, except when you want to take that to your final spot, no wheelbarrow required. You just push it off its stand and you just roll it on over there. So it's essentially just a tumbler composter with a step removed. They're just a little bit more freedom and flexibility in the workspace. So again, they lock. You've got higher temperatures happening easier. So one thing just on this tip, it reminded me, you might see like compost inoculant or starters. They tend to be a little expensive. Some of the best research shows if you're looking to jumpstart your compost pile at home, especially if you have a tumbler because it's not in contact with the exposed ground. Adding in some finished composted manure or buying in a little baggie of finished compost is actually shown to be more productive. It's also more cost efficient, but is more productive in inoculating your compost. So if you guys choose to go with a tumbler or a rolling bin, remember it's not in contact with the ground. So just adding in some composted manure, adding in finished compost, choosing one of those, and again, just a smaller bag, just throwing it in there to jumpstart your compost pile will really do wonders for it. Small batch composters and vermicomposters, those are if you're in real tight spaces. The vermicomposting, it's a lot of fun. We do it in the children's garden with our kids. These generally use red wigglers, and these are native to Europe. They are not a native worm here in North America. So you don't want to just dump them into the landscape. It's kind of you're committing to keeping a pet, essentially. When you have these vermicomposters, you are adding in your food scraps and things like that, which is what your worms are feeding on, and they're breaking it down for you. But these have to be exposed to warmer temperatures. They're not going to survive the winter outside in a vermicomposter. So if you have this at home, we recommend just bring it in your garage if possible. A shed would do. We bring it into one of our greenhouses in the winter. The reason I bring up like where these worms are from though, we don't want people to do this vermicomposter in the warm months and then just pitch the worms in the winter. Because one, it's a little inhumane. I know they're just worms. We go fishing all the time, but we don't want to encourage people to do that. But also, you know, if you do add these worms to the soil, they actually can survive in the soil there over the winter. And there's already an issue with invasive earthworms and our native earthworms, and we don't want to exacerbate it. So if you do choose a vermicomposter, we just like people to kind of think of it as adopting a new, very, very low maintenance pet that helps contribute to it being there. So these vermicomposters are cool because you're feeding these worms these scraps, they're breaking it down. When done right, they are odor free, they're good for indoor. Let's see. And these guys are always working. They're always eating. What they excrete is that nutrient dense, kind of rich material. But you also get, in addition to the worm castings in the compost, the leftovers of the worms feeding. If you look at the base of this, we also get what we call worm tea, which is like a really nice liquid nutrient that we can add to soil. I also have people that do this indoors at home, and they use that to fertilize their indoor plants. So they don't even have gardens, and they're composting at home, and they're able to help their indoor plants out. So it's kind of cool motivation for people to compost, even if they don't have an area outside where they can spread their compost. But vermicomposters, they have a lot of different layers to them. The complexity depends on the vermicomposter you buy. I've seen some that only have like 2 layers and a tea collection area at the bottom with a spigot. This one's a little more complicated with some extra layers in there, but it all kind of depends on your motivation factor. But again, these are great for small spaces, and they do need to come inside, even if it is like your garage or something like that in the winter. The pyramid style one, I'll show you the picture real quick there. These are some of our favorites of the garden because of the locking lid and the size of them. So these are super vented with their airflow. The lid keeps out animals, because again, we're not throwing bones or anything like that, but occasionally, especially at the garden, because we have a pretty active ecosystem, but we don't have a lot of predators here, so we do have raccoons that tend to be a bit curious. This keeps them out. And these, they're just a nice tidier space to it. Some of them have little rollers like you can see on the far right-hand side, but most of them are just gonna have a little hatch at the front of the compost bin that you can just open and scoop the materials out of. I will say these are a little harder to turn, but that's part of the reason that they have a little more ventilation on the sides, so there's still a bit more airflow through that as well. I just wanted to touch on the end, towards the end of this presentation. This is some cool new technology. I remember when they were crowdsourcing and funding for this, but there are kitchen composters. One of the most successful ones that is actually on the market nowadays is Lomi. This is advertising compost in 4 hours. Now, this isn't true compost, but it is kind of dehydrating and almost like pulverizing. So it's creating a different type of soil amendment. I wouldn't say it's as biologically active as like a true compost is, but this is getting the word out there to people about recycling their kitchen scraps. So it's not true compost per se, but it's a step in the right direction because it's not getting trashed. You know, it's creating a product that you can add into your soil. It's mostly just going to be like an organic material source. But I will say it is very expensive right now for anybody interested in it. I briefly, just because I have a couple minutes, I wanted to talk on bokashi fermenters. Now, this is also another composting option for people in small spaces who don't have access to the outside. You're able to compost a wider range of materials, including meat and dairy. It's very fast composting, and that in itself is impressive because it's happening inside. And you get a nutrient-rich kind of pre-compost material that you could bury, as well as like a compost like tea. You do have to buy specific materials to do this. This is anaerobic decomposition, so there's no oxygen, or it's a removal of oxygen. So you do need an airtight container, and the bokashi systems have like a drainage system as well. You layer in your kitchen scraps. Again, you can include meat and dairy with this. They have a specific inoculant of these anaerobic functioning bacteria. And then you have like what we call the bran that you add to this. So it could be like a wheat germ, a wheat bran, even some sawdusts. And it's mixed with like molasses, like sugars, and other different microorganisms. So it's a specific product you buy, that bokashi brand, that helps jumpstart this system. Again, you buy it as a kit, and it's its own self-contained ecosystem. So this is not traditional compost in a sense. It has a spigot at the bottom. You drain off that tea to use as a fertilizer. But it's definitely it's its own separate breed of composting. I believe like some of the organisms in it, or microorganisms in it, include like lactic acid bacteria. They also use some yeasts in there as well, and I think like different phototrophic bacteria. So it's definitely a highly specialized system. But again, it allows you to compost meat and dairy. So it's unique in its sense, but I just would like to stress that again, this is the only way at home that you would be able to compost meat and dairy scraps. I did want to give a shout out, like they have no affiliation with this program or anything, my program tonight, but from personal experience, I can speak to how phenomenal this company is. This is Tidewater Compost. I remember when these two guys were just talking about the idea of it, and I was like, one of the main things I get after composting classes is like, do we have local systems? And now we do. Tidewater Compost is these two guys that started this great local company. It's basically a compost subscription service. For anybody that lives in Norfolk, they actually created a community drop-off point in Colley Avenue at the new Elizabeth River Project building. It's this really cool kind of community event. But monthly, or however you decide to schedule it with them, they give you like a bucket and compostable liners, and then they come collect it for you, and they return, they replace it with a clean bucket, all that good stuff. And then eventually like you get like some of their composted finished product. It is a composting service, so they take it off site for you, so you don't have to do it. But what's really cool about this is they compost everything. And I'm speaking from experience. I actually work part-time at a brewery, and we have a restaurant. It's called Elation in Norfolk, and we have been working with these guys for months, and they have helped us compost over 3,000 pounds of our kitchen scraps. And they're able to compost fats and greases. They compost compostable silverware and plates and things like that you can't compost at home. They compost cheeses, all that stuff. So it is really cool that my community here in Norfolk and the surrounding cities has access to a compost program. So I'm really excited to just kind of like talk about them. I encourage you to explore their website. And we're actually looking at using them at the garden and when we can open our restaurant with the new construction. So I just wanted to give them a shout out. It's really exciting to see the kind of change in perception of compost with people as we learn more about it. And depending on where you are, who knows, maybe you know a couple young people that are looking to start something like this, because there's no one else in our area that does this. But with that, I think I'm just at my time. I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me tonight. I know I talk fast, but before I dive through the questions in the chat, I did just want to share this email address. It's called askaplantquestion@nbgs.org. This is an email address that puts you in direct contact, not just with me, but our education, the rest of our education department, our horticulture department as well, including the VP or the director of horticulture, and all of the staff. So if you have a question that is, plant related, throw it in there. If you have a question that is bug related, bird related, name it. If you are trying to start a rain garden in your yard and you don't know how, shoot us a question. This is wildly underutilized, so you usually get a pretty fast and thorough response from our team. The only other thing I could say is keep this on file. And when you send us questions, like, why did my plant die? Or my houseplant looks unhealthy? Or what bug is this? The more pictures you can send us with that email, the better. So again, totally free resource. Not a lot of people use it, so we're happy to answer questions, but just jot that down. It's askaplantquestion@nbgs.org. With that, I'm going to scroll through the chat here and answer some questions. So yeah, let's see. What date is the construction, or what date should the construction be finished? We are looking construction, like on the greenhouses and stuff, we're actually on track to finish next year. We are looking more of like a grand opening with the restaurant and the visitor center and all of that stuff the following year. So like 2026 is like kind of the grand opening, if you will. But we actually are going to be able to finish construction in different phases. And like right now, the glass panels and all that stuff's going up on the greenhouses. So it's really cool to watch. They're moving really fast. Can you tell us more about the June visit? So I am leading a kind of like a pollinator walk through the garden. So June is a phenomenal time because there's a lot of activity going on. We're going to go through the garden and I talk on all of the native plants and pollinator relationships, how to kind of create habitat that's beneficial for our pollinators. And we'll go through different areas. Usually I start at the visitor center. At the hummingbird garden, we'll go through the Virginia native plant garden, and usually I make our way through the meadow, that beautiful patch of orange flowers you saw, and then end at our butterfly house and talk on that. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking to you guys about in June. I cannot remember off the top of my head the specific date, and I do know it's in the morning because it's going to get hot later in the day, and morning we'll have more activity with pollinators anyway. So
it's the 15th. It's the 15th, Alex. Yeah, I put it in. It's just a little further down, the 15th from 10 to 11:30.
Perfect. And I do have it on my calendar. Just let's see. Eggshells. I've read that the decomposition takes too long. It's hardly worth including. Yeah, so just to touch back on that, for those eggshells to break down into a viable nutrient source, on the surface level, it takes way too long, and you run the risk of accumulating sodium in the soil faster than the calcium that's viable. So adding them to the compost pile, they'll eventually break down, and they will break down into a more usable source of calcium for your plants. The smaller you can break those eggshells down, the faster that they will decompose. It's 100% worth it to throw it in your compost pile versus a trash can though. So would definitely recommend doing that. Also, if you are a bird fan, you can take those eggshells, as long as they haven't been boiled in like salt water. You can take those eggshells, you dry them out a little bit. You could like zap it in your microwave or like on a low temperature in your oven. You just want to dry the eggshells. You don't want them to brown. And then you break it into small sizes, smaller than your pinky nail. And you can set it out with your bird food. Some birds, especially blue jays, as they are preparing to nest, they need to intake a lot of calcium fast, and naturally they would do this eating other birds' eggshells or like snail shells. So I've actually been able to put out eggshells for the birds, and they'll pick at it when they need it. So that's another thing you could kind of test out and see if anybody in your neighborhood's interested. See if they take you up on that. But like I said, blue jays usually around here are the ones that I see that do that the most. Let's see. Compost bin for Christmas, started composting, but didn't put a layer of sticks or chips in the bottom. Should empty the bin and do that. No need to empty it. That's gonna be a lot of work. It's kind of just one of those things if you wanted to jumpstart it to add that. I would just say it is worthwhile to make sure when you stir that bin to try and get to the bottom to kind of flip and rotate those materials. But at this point, I wouldn't restart your pile or try and take it all out. That's gonna be a lot of work for you. Coffee grounds. I assume you can include the coffee filters. Absolutely. The coffee filters, totally. We are compostable. We do that here at the garden. One thing I would like to say on coffee grounds, I see a lot of people in the past few years picking up those coffee grounds from Starbucks that are spent. You need to compost those. They are an organic material. They are really acidic, which, you know, most of our vegetables and native plants like. But you want to compost them before you add them to your soil. If you don't, they can create a mat, like a hydrophobic, a water repelling mat, which is not good for our plants. Or if you know you put those coffee grounds just straight up on your soil, barely mix it in, and then you throw something on top, it will create a layer that is hydrophobic. And additionally, if you throw coffee grounds just as is into a vegetable garden you're starting, they actually inhibit germination of seeds. So like it's kind of good in a sense if you think about weeds, but it's not good because if you're starting vegetables from seed or you have little transplants, that will inhibit their growth. So coffee grounds and the filters, throw them in the compost pile. How do the decomposers get into the tumbler bins? Eventually, naturally, they would make their way from like the things you're adding. But like just a little reminder, like I said, it is kind of worthwhile to add a little bit of like a baggie of finished compost or a baggie of composted manure if you can. Great. I think that's all the questions in the chat. So super happy you guys tuned in tonight. Hopefully motivated some of y'all to start composting at home or get some people, you know, excited to compost. And I look forward to seeing whoever shows up in June.
Hey, Alex, I have one question. I didn't put
Yeah,
it in the
absolutely.
chat. So like on my counter composter, I have, it came with these bags that they, you know, pretty much say, you know, this will get you a week and then it'll start to decompose. And they say it's fine to throw in your compost bin. You know, I'm talking about I don't know if they're cornstarch material,
Yeah.
but
Yep. So we've utilized those here at the garden, and in our experience, they just don't break down efficiently. Like
okay.
they eventually will, but we just don't see we have the consistently high enough temperatures they need because they are marketed as compostable, but like our experience with those, they're just not that efficient for a home composter. Like we will have like a nice finished texture and you will still find like the bag strips and stuff in there. And you can tell that they're breaking down, but it's just so much slower than everything else.
Okay. But so I guess my question is if you if you're using them, because I do notice mine, like if truly if I don't have it out there in 5 days,
Yeah.
it's starting
Yeah,
to destroy.
yeah, they're not
I
stable.
suppose you could just sort of pull any remnants out. I guess what I'm
Yeah.
asking is they're not hurting anything, right? They're
Yep, yeah.
just slowing it down.
Yep, and yeah,
Oh,
it's still better than like a plastic option. So
yeah.
it's just
Okay.
a little slower than the rest of it.
Okay, great. And I have one other question.
Mhm.
For folks who are coming to the June event, and will they need to pay the entrance fee to get into the garden, or do they say that they're there for a program? Do you know how that works?
It it varies. I think if you've been coordinating with Teresa through this, usually how it works, she'll have um she'll have whoever you send this out to will give you like a link and they can
Okay,
register through the program.
okay,
And that
okay,
way, once they've registered and they show up, we have a toll booth, then they just say like, I'm with the Episcopal Diocese program, and they'll just get let in.
okay,
So yeah,
great.
I'll check in with Teresa, and once we get a little closer to that date, we'll create a registration link. And this is, I'm assuming this is what she'll do because this is normally how we do it. And then that way you can send it to folks who want to register.
Great, thank you. Well,
Yeah, absolutely.
any last minute questions from anybody who's still here before we let Alex go probably eat her dinner? Um, I mean, on behalf of the diocese, Alex, really appreciate it. And on behalf of the Creation Care team, thanks so much. Um,
Yeah,
and I appreciate your time and your wisdom. And we'll look forward to seeing you again in June when we walk at the garden.
awesome. Well, I hope you guys have a good night. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex. Everybody
Bye.
else have a good one.